Today on Rebuilders, we are looking at the 3 underreported
megatrends
that are shaping culture.
That just says it all.
It really does.
I don't need to add to that.
No.
People are going to want to know what these unreported megatrends are. So start listening.
Welcome to Rebuilders. My name is Liddy and I'm here with Mark and Daniel. How are you both going?
Jolly swell.
Jolly swell. I'm going good, thanks.
Great.
Yeah.
Yes.
Daniel, are you keeping a list of all of the ways that you respond and make sure that you do it different every
to
time?
mix it
You're
up.
working through
I
a
like-
list.
Look, it's spontaneous. I don't have a
Okay.
list, but I do like to mix it up each week.
Good on you.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
What's been happening?
Well, I think we shared with our audience the dramas, the ups, the downs of the bird which lived in my letterbox.
I was thinking about that the
Sure
other day.
did.
Who's gone, moved to my, where I park my car under. We call it in Australia a carport.
A carport, yes.
But it's now vacated from there. So it's completely gone from my property. But we have in the rebuilders world a new animal in our midst.
we do.
So underneath
In our midst.
in our midst. What's in our midst? We began to notice in our offices that there was this big hole that would appear under the building and something was digging under there. So there's been a great sort of, sense of level of excitement in the office because in Australia you can get possums into your roofs and stuff like this. And they can
Which
cause
we have
problems,
had issues
Which
with.
we've had issues
yes.
with.
Yes.
We released Daniel up there and under there with a knife. No, not really.
No.
So this we just kept reappearing this hole. So anyway, a camera was set up.
Yes.
Kelly set up a camera, and it's been a while. Like we've been waiting for a while for footage.
Couple of weeks, yeah.
Finally, the villain of the piece was spotted, and it's
Well, I mean, I'm still dubious as to whether it is
Yeah.
indeed the villain.
Because we've seen other
There's other
suspects.
Yeah.
well, it's causing tension in the team.
Yes. Yeah.
Which
there you go.
Yeah,
Divisive.
I think it's the fox.
Okay. Yeah. So we saw a fox come
Yeah,
past
sorry,
the
At
I
night.
ruined the
Yeah, no.
drama there.
I
Yes,
also-
there's a fox. So we didn't see the fox digging,
No.
but the fox appeared. But
Sniffing around. Sniffing
Came
around
into the camera view. Yeah.
yeah.
Sniffing around the little.
where the hole was, which has now been filled in. The fox came back, sniffed around.
So how do we scare off a fox? We've been told by the experts. We've got an expert in. Daniel, you can tell us what the expert told us to do.
Well, foxes are territorial animals, and one way they like to mark their territory is similar to dogs, because it is kind of a dog species.
Are they canines? Are foxes canines?
I don't know. Daniel, you've got the Google there.
This,
Oh, so do you, Mark.
I do.
I've got my
Good.
phone. I could do
Anyway,
that.
Yeah.
so the advice was someone to urinate where that hole is
Yeah.
to claim our territory
Yeah.
over the fox.
Which we do not want happening in office hours.
No,
I think this
because
could-
my
this could be-
desk
Yeah.
is right behind that window.
Yeah. So anyway, so just audience, think of us as we deal with this great
Yeah.
workplace dilemma.
And if you too have a problem with foxes, now you know
Yeah, now you
how
know what to do.
You could, help improve that situation.
Fun fact for our listeners, though, some people may know, foxes aren't native to Australia. They
No.
are a pest.
Yeah,
Yes.
they're introduced.
Yes.
They are. So
Canines are so-called canids, including foxes, wolves, jackals, and other members of the dog family. So
Hyenas?
they are.
a hyena's part of it.
Oh man, come on! We've got a podcast to do here.
So we'll come back to.
Yeah, sub podcast Daniel's zoology.
Oh, very good. Well, we'll keep you updated on
Yeah.
what's happening with the fox.
Maybe we could even release the footage in our subscriber chats.
Of the fox.
Yeah.
We could do that.
1,000 new people just subscribed,
Never seen a fox before.
but there will be no footage of the solution.
No, ever.
No.
They're not. Hyenas aren't, just by the way.
Okay.
Hyenas
good.
aren't.
Good.
What family are they part of?
They have a family of all of their own.
Oh,
I can't pronounce it. Hyenidae or something. So anyway,
interesting.
carry on.
There you go.
Yeah. That's why they laugh. Or is that jackal? I don't know.
No, hyenas laugh.
Yeah, they're like, we've got our own one.
The arrogance,
wow.
the sheer
Yeah,
arrogance of
yeah.
hyenas.
Man. The arrogance of the elect.
Oh, wow. Okay. Today's episode, we are going to look at 3 underreported trends that are shaping culture. It's been a while since we've sort of done a purely cultural analysis episode.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we're excited to explore it a little bit. So we've got 3 things that we're going to go through. And I'm going to pose one question to start us off, unless you want to frame it up a little bit more.
Well, I'll frame up a little bit more in the sense that I think, I was trying to think around, what are some of the trends that actually are influencing things under the surface?
Yeah.
And I was speaking to a group yesterday, and one thing I shared with them was that, a lot of people, the world changed in 2016, felt like the world changed, and people adapted to that. There was a culture war, all kinds of different things going on. Politics seemed to radically change. But I think that sort of little interruption period, from 2016 really sort of ended in 2022. Not ended, but is changing.
Sure.
So what are the dynamics that are driving now? And what are ones that perhaps are under the surface a little bit, under noticed, but actually are having a big effect?
Yeah.
So we'll talk about them.
Great. Well, I'm going to lead us in with, if the economy is growing, why do I feel so bad?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one. So there's this sort of conversation going where I've talked about it before on the podcast, but it's one of the biggest political stories driving all kinds of elections and even the fate of societies and governments is the cost of living crisis.
Yep.
What's happened to the economy, particularly post COVID, which has older precedents to what is happening now. But there was just an interesting article about the Australian economy, but I think this applies to many other economies, but it just piqued something and captured something. Because what's happening at the moment is individuals are very obviously feeling the pain. You see that. The cost of living crisis is all over the place. Often some countries, you read the press here and it's like, the Australian cost of living crisis, but it's happening everywhere,
Yes.
And people tend to look at their own government and what they've done, but this is a global phenomenon. And it's also a global phenomenon in the fact that, more developing countries are finding absolute turmoil. We're seeing riots and coups and protest movements, places like Kenya, Bangladesh, all across the world. So these changes in the economy that have been wrought by COVID, Ukraine war, are having a huge effect. But then you have this sort of counter narrative, often by incumbent governments, that the figures actually are good. The economy is actually growing. And so you sort of have people like, I don't really feel that is what is happening in my individual life. And people can say these companies on the stock market, say in America, you've had the Magnificent 7 tech companies who have been just making so much money, like up until recently, NVIDIA, companies like this, AI companies, tech companies, really driving some incredible growth for a period. But then the average person, like I saw an article today in Australia, butter is just going up to these ridiculous prices. And in Europe, it's going up.
It really is.
It is. Like butter used to be dirt cheap. You don't want dirt in your butter. But there is this, so there's this this is creating a cultural tension because the prevailing incumbent governments are saying everything's good, be happy people. And publics are going, I don't feel good. And so there was this really interesting little quote, which I think sort of captured this in an article in our national broadcast, the ABC here. And it was just talking about what is happening at the moment. This is just at the start of the article. It said, new figures published on Wednesday are expected to again show the Australian economy growing weakly, as in not strong, weakly. So that's firstly interesting. So there's economic growth happening, but it's a very weak growth.
Yep.
So I'll continue on. I'll start again. New figures published on Wednesday are expected to again show the Australian economy growing weakly overall, but shrinking on a per-person basis, highlighting the strain on households, which economists say have been masked by migration. I'll come back to migration in a second. But really what this is saying is you can have an economic situation where your overall gross domestic product, which is the health of the overarching economy, can be growing, but individuals' standard of living is declining. And this is the tension driving so much of the political environment right now, and that is going to drive the next few years unless there's some significant changes. So to put this in really simple perspective, because I know economics can be a little bit complex for some people, but imagine the rebuilders team, right?
Yep.
We had a GDP. what all of us are earning, and just say Daniel and I, our wages go down by 15%, but yours goes up by 5%, Liddy. The overarching GDP of the rebuilders economy will have significantly gone up. We would have had growth in our GDP, but for the majority of us, me and Daniel, we actually would have experienced a decline in living standards.
Right.
And so this is like a driving engine of discontent, and it's a contradiction.
Yes.
So what this is doing is we have an economy, particularly in certain countries. So in Australia, some of that's been masked by the fact that we're a very resource-rich country. And in the US, it's been marked by the fact that the tech companies have been absolutely rocking and bringing in huge amounts of money. But that money isn't dribbling down in the way that it used to. The nature of the very much tech companies actually, it doesn't flow down into the rest of the economy. But what it is doing is it's accruing wealth increasingly in a smaller group of people.
Yes.
So I've talked about it before, but Oxfam did an interesting study that post-COVID, that the amounts of financial inequality in the world is absolutely skyrocketed. A smaller group of people are making more and more money. And this has very real world implications. So what it means is there's a small groups or small parts of the economy doing really well. Now, part of what's happened with the US economy, that this has been very much based around the AI boom.
Yeah.
So economies at different times need to find sources of growth. After World War II, there was a tremendous source of growth through industry. Companies, the West, like Ford factory in Detroit or whatever it was, made money. Australia made stuff. Many countries made stuff. And there was this industrial economy which wages went up and the economy went up. But we're now finding this disconnect, which really has been happening in the world since 1973, but was sort of covered over by the fact that people could get cheap goods because China came online and was making stuff cheap. But now this is now run aground. So in the US, there is a source of growth, which has been tech companies, particularly around artificial intelligence. But that's even now starting to run aground as people are realizing that, hang on, AI may not have the benefits. It's so expensive to develop. So Sam Altman was asking for trillions of dollars or something crazy to keep developing open AI, plus also the energy costs of keeping all AI going. There's also increasingly interesting articles. Futurism's had a couple of articles in the last couple of weeks of, there's a growing sense that AI may be collapsing because the more AI has to train itself off large data sets of information. Elon Musk, one of the reasons people speculate he bought Twitter was not just as a political reason, that's part of it, but also gave him a huge data set of human interactions and thoughts with a large interactive platform. And that's fed into AI to train it of how to think. Reddit has rumored been used by other groups. And so some of the stuff that you've put into emails and social media platforms over the last part of your life is being used to train AI. Now, the problem is AI is going to increasingly fill the internet with its own content.
Yes.
So when it starts to train itself on its own content, it actually starts to degrade. This is like a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy. So it's not training itself on human thought, it's actually training itself on its own thought, and its ability degrades. So this and other worries are starting to, a lot of people who wanted to get in early on the AI boom are starting to say this may not be financially worth it. So those stocks are going down. But going back to the big point here is that there's been a number of sugar hits which have been covering this problem. So in Australia, which is a huge amount. Australia is one of the world's biggest immigrant countries. We've had a huge amount of migration, and particularly post COVID, when Australia hit economic troubles, as most of the world did with the economic shock of COVID. Part of that was because our migration went down. So since we've had a massive amount of migrants, and migrants do indeed stimulate an economy because they've got to be housed, they've got to buy stuff, they change employment. And the traditional understanding of recessions, of when you're in a recession, is a few quarters of low economic growth, but also it's around levels of unemployment. Now, we're in this weird situation at the moment because baby boomers are a big generation who are retiring, so there's increasingly open spaces in the open roles in the workforce. Plus, it looks like we've got pretty good full employment compared to historical periods like the Great Depression or the early 90s recession, where a lot of people are out of work. So we're in this really weird situation where governments are saying we're not in a recession. we're not, we're growing. Interest rates have come down a little bit, but it's not actually translating into the lived experience. And even to the point where what is happening is that it's really key when standards of living decrease. So when there is inflation inevitably means that your standards of living will decrease. So that's what we're feeling. Another interesting stat is when population decline begins to happen also, which we're starting to experience soon, is that also that degrades your standard of living. This has been very real in the United Kingdom and the US, which are seeing declines in actual life expectancy.
Yeah, wow.
There was an interesting study done recently around health in the English-speaking world, and everyone basically bar Australia has started to see declines in their overall health in Ireland, Canada, the US. So I think Australians now live 5 years longer than people in the United States. And I think we're now 2 or 3 years longer than the UK. We can look up the exact details of that. And even Canada and Ireland, which I think used to be paced with us, have actually started to decline. But interesting, I think in England, poorer people in England lived up to 10 years shorter than more wealthy people in England, where that's less of a gap in Australia because of Medicare and what happened in the 80s. So, there's people who are seeing like, hang on, I don't have as much money. I can't afford the lifestyle I did. Plus also, this is affecting my health now. It affects infrastructure. So this is so much what is driving politics at the moment. You look at the US election, and there's all kinds of things, happening. Trump will say this crazy thing, and Kamala Harris is being rebranded in this way, and there's influences here. And so much is actually smoke and mirrors around the underlying social, I think what the public is deeply interested in, not interested in, affecting them, is this ongoing cost of living crisis. And again, too, I say that often people say, what can the Australian government do with this? Or what can the Canadian government or the French government? This is a global trend that's not going to go away very quickly. I was in Canberra yesterday, and I took my daughter to our old Parliament House, and they've got this little bit where we had a new Parliament House, and that we moved out of it in the I think it was the early 90s or late 80s. Anyway, they've kept part of it like it was in the 80s. So you can go into the office of the Prime Minister in the 1980s, and they had a political ad that came on, and it was of our former Prime Minister Bob Hawke, and my daughter was with me. Grace is 16, and it came on. It's like Bob Hawke in 1986 or something 88 going, Australia is now got the fastest growing economy in the Western world. We've halved interest rates, strikes are down, personal wages are rising, and there's all these wonderful 80s Australian beach images and the actor Brian Brown walking out at some award, and it was fascinating because I remember seeing stuff like that when I was a kid and understanding periods. But for Grace, it was shocking, like in a way, because she was almost like, what? Like that a government could come through something like that and start to say that stuff, because it's actually the opposite of what's happening now. So this is beginning to fray the social contract. And this is the point I want to land on with this one is social contract is a really key part of political theory and cultural theory. It's that the public says to the government, we're going to let you have power and we're going to hand over some of our freedom to you. So, for example, you can't leave your country without a passport. The government can put you in jail, or it can make laws that you have to adhere to. So we hand over some of our freedom to the government in a social contract, but we do that because we want something back for them. So part of it is, well, you guys run the economy, you run law and order, you run these things, and societies are safe and stable and flourishing when that is working, that relationship. So I don't know, again, if we were in, a rebuilder's share house where, the agreement was, well, Daniel, does the dishes and you do the washing and I mop the floors, and things will go well when we're doing that well. But as soon as the dishes are piling up or I've not mopped the floors, tensions come in. And that's what's happening in our societies. So underneath so much stuff is this ongoing destabilizing force that is actually in many ways, I think, starting to get louder than the culture war. So the big point here too is this is getting louder than the culture war, and a lot of churches, a lot of people, a lot of Christians have been attuned to the culture war. And, I know a lot of churches, particularly in the US, are like dreading the next election. But what comes after the next election is the fact that regardless of who gets in, this will be a destabilizing effect. And I think we've talked about this before. So our current Prime Minister, who just hasn't been in too long, very low, he's unpopular because he's not getting on top of this issue. Keir Starmer, I talked about the other week, new UK Prime Minister got in a big majority in Parliament, but he's already got really low favourability ratings because of this issue.
Yes.
So this is going to be an ongoing destabilising issue. Okay, so how do Christians, look at this? Number one, I'd say we need people, I think that people have got a creative and, first of all, people who are in the marketplace, we need new economic stories where actually we can find new ways of growth that actually can grow our economies, in ways that are not sugar hits, that are genuine and real. And another way I'd say for churches more broadly is the cost of living crisis. While it may not be people flaming each other on Twitter or articles that you read about, in the newspaper or things that may get you passionate, the cost of living crisis is increasingly going to be real in our communities. And that's a question many churches need to ask the question, how do we respond to that?
Yeah.
So that's number one. So the question you posed was, if the economy is growing, why do I feel so bad? The mega trend that I'm outlaying here that's going to keep driving is the ongoing destabilizing nature of this disconnect between the overarching, what we're told is the health of the economy, and how individuals are feeling it.
Can I ask a quick question on it?
Yes.
I'm just wondering whether, is part of it the increase of lifestyle and comfort over the last couple of decades, and then suddenly people can't do what they used to be able to do because it costs more or whatever. And so there's just a felt thing of things have gotten better, but suddenly we can't do it. So things aren't maybe that bad, but comparative to
what it was
years ago.
Totally.
Is that?
Yeah, I mean, let's go back to 1988, right? In 1988.
I remember it well.
But just compare it, and you could even go to 1998,
I do remember that.
You do remember? Okay,
yeah,
good.
I can remember that.
Number one, there's no social media. You don't pay a huge amount for a mobile phone. You may not have a mobile phone, so you don't pay that out of your bill. You don't have internet. Don't need to pay that. Most people may be privileged to have a European holiday once in their life, if they're lucky. You probably go on vacation or holidays by going an hour away and going to the beach in a cheap rental. You don't eat out at restaurants. There's actually not that many restaurants around. Coffee is what you pull out of your cupboard, or at work, or maybe it's cheap. You go to gigs were like $15. You know what I mean? And bands actually didn't make much money. I mean, there's literally something that came out now. Literally, there's a. I think it's like the. People are asking in Australia, bands, we've gotten some, I don't know who they're, union or group or representative or focus lobby group or whatever, are literally saying that, the government should support bands to make a lifestyle. If you look at all this is a very Australian issue for international, but look at the great Australian bands of the 80s, whether it's AC/DC or Midnight Oil or, these bands, the first part of their lives, they've got no money. Do you know what I mean? Like New Order, probably one of the greatest sort of indie electronic art, bands from Manchester. Was something insane. Like they were earning £70, for most of their career, until later. And so there is part of it that our expectations, because all of a sudden, to buy a DVD player or a video player was so expensive.
Yeah.
You bought one TV, your grandma had the TV she'd bought 30 years earlier. Now, part of that too is that planned obsolescence of stuff that, so I'm not blaming people. I'm just saying, that you could buy cheap stuff. I mean, look at the increased, we've seen this ongoing thing where you sort of had like cheap, fast fashion at, I don't know, Forever 21 or, these companies which came in and, the Gap or, like whatever, made sort of cheaper stuff. And then you sort of had H&M, but now you've got Temu. You know, there's ads for Temu coming up. He's like a Parker for $3. Like, what is going on?
And sign up today and you get $5 off. So.
Yeah, exactly. And they spin that wheel. I'm like, just go away. And there's stuff like they're selling products. I don't even know what these products are. They're like bits of plastic. What do you do with that? So there is an element that wages didn't increase, but cheap stuff coming online increased. So all of a sudden, you know, like the movies, you know, used to be cheaper, but you didn't have Netflix. The Netflix model would not have worked in 1998 because people would have gone, I can't afford to pay that monthly. You had a landline where it was 20 cents a phone call. You know, so families had one car.
Yeah.
You know, you caught the train. So a lot of this stuff, I think you're right. It is perhaps one way of looking at this. And I do want to say, like, again, too, I just want to bring up caveat. This is really hurting developing nations, people who are in the precariat, as people call it, the precarious part of the economy with low-paying jobs. But again, too, you think about this, like people again, let's go back to 1998. People on the edges, so you know, often it was working people who may work in a factory, you know, and sometimes those factories were shuttered, but you had more job protection. Now that people talk about the precariat, which is these precarious jobs, it's an Uber driver or Deliveroo where you may not get a booking. You know what I mean? So it's much more precarious. So there's definitely that there. I don't want to underplay that. But also I do wonder whether this is a correction from a really unrealistic period, which again too is, we've talked about this before, was on low interest rates, printing money, China's emergence into the global economy, which now that doesn't work for them anymore. They've got an economic malaise. But the question is the pain, because there's no articles in the paper going, oh, geez, yeah, we needed to correct. You know, there's particles. There's articles in the paper going, you know, young people can't afford to do this and we're really angry at the older generation, et cetera, et cetera. So there's going to be a political cost for this. That is coming, and that's going to shape the next phase of politics, less so than the culture war.
Yes, yeah.
Well, another question
to
pose. Well, for the second unreported trend.
Yeah, second trend.
Why are so many people lonely?
I think we just talked about capital in terms of money in the economy. But another trend which is affecting all of this, and we've talked before that crises cascade into other crises. And one crisis that's happening at the same time as this economic crisis is that there has been a decline in social capital. Social capital is a term that you can measure the health of a community on their economic output, but you also can measure the health of a community on their relational, you know, connection. I think it was Joseph Myers wrote a book, The Search to Belong. I think it was called. Can you fact check that for me, Daniel? A number of years ago, and he just talked about the really thing I remember for that book was that he talked about these different circles that humans need to belong, different kinds of sizes of community. There's the smallest one, which is intimacy, which might be with like, you know, a spouse or a partner, the person who'd be the most vulnerable with, spend the most time with. Then you may have a smaller one, which might be 3 or 4 people who, you know, your closest friends, could be family members, could be the nuclear family, you know, like, again, spending lots of time. You're more open and vulnerable with the ones who will provide the most support for you in a crisis. Then you might have your group of, you know, 6 to 30 closer friends, acquaintances. You know, different people have got different levels of this. And then you sort of got your village. I'm not doing exactly as he did it. This is my sort of remembering it, having read it 15 years ago. Your sort of, you know, village unit, let's call it that. There's sort of 200 to 300 people that you know, and if you live in a smaller town, you know, you might have that where you go, I know that you don't know them, but you sort of give a nod. Yeah. But that still gives you something like, I feel known in a little bit. They're part of my community. Then different if you're, you know, walking around a big city completely anonymous. And then you got your sort of like, say, sporting team where maybe you're all in a stadium and you're wearing the same colours and you're supporting that team, or maybe you're following your nation in the Olympics or a football match or something. You don't know everyone, but there's something like we're all you know, cheering that team on. We're all wearing the same colours. We're from this city. You know, Australia, Melbourne, whatever your team is, Manchester United, you know, the Dodgers, whatever. So, you know, these are really important for human health. But what we've seen is we've seen the decline in numbers of them. You know, if you think about, you know, intimacy, the intimate one, you know, particularly, you know, I think, you know, you see casual sex and hookup culture has really sort of undermined that smallest thing where it's almost has elements of the anonymousness of a big city in our smallest intimate circles. You know, breakdown of the family, struggle to connect, you know, and so all across these, what we've seen is them decline. Now, what's interesting is I think part of what happens with culture war and polarization is it gives you a sort of like sports team type vibe, stadium. Oh, we're against them, you know, and political connectivity with other people. We're part of this tribe, you know, and you're seeing this increasingly that, you know, I don't think it's here as much, but you sort of can see it here a little bit. But, you know, in America, you can almost see these different signs of what political tribe people belong to by their clothes, you know, and what they're wearing or bumper stickers or whatever. So, you know, one of the really interesting thing is there's an interesting book, I think it was Daniel Aldrich wrote a book on social capital and resilience in natural disasters. And, you know, basically what he said was that communities that have higher levels of social capital are able to bounce back from crises a lot easier. But communities which have low social capital are devastated by disasters, natural disasters. And he looks at Japan and Fukushima and some of these earthquakes and so on. So, you know, if your town gets hit by a flood and you've got good, strong relationships in all those different spheres that we just outlaid, you know, where the town comes together, where you've got, you know, the closest people to you emotionally supporting you. You've got some key people going to come over and help you move your house. Your neighbours in your street are working together. You see all of that, you know, working well. But the last few years, you know, COVID, polarization, increasing hyper-individualism, consumerism. Part of the fantasy world of that economy, Daniel, wasn't just the economic fantasy, but it was also the fantasy that you could live a life without attachments for others. And so this is rapidly declined. And I think, you know, for church, what this means is that two things. Number one, there's been a period where it was really often hard to build community in the fantasy period because radical individualism was king. But I think we're seeing now, and I think we're just at the start of it, where increasingly people are realizing I'm bereft in my social capital. It may manifest in a mental health, you know, diagnosis. And what a counsellor may say to someone is, oh, you need more connections. And a lot of people go, I don't have them, you know. And, you know, I saw a tragic article the other day. It's like in Japan, increasingly people are dying and no one finds them for 5 years. Like tragedy. And, you know, so I think we're going to see another trend. This is another under the ground, under the surface destabilizing factor that, you know, people get drawn to ideology, fascism, communism, hyper-nationalism, when they don't have those social capitals in place. That, you know, again, churches have the capacity to build. We're noticing a difference at Red, where it's a lot easier to put people into small group. We call them discipleship groups. You may call them cell groups, small groups, whatever you call them, connect groups. We're seeing people jumping into that more because there is a hunger for community that is across so many places, you know. And I just encourage people to push into that. And I know particularly places where it's been polarized, that feels like that's been torn apart by that. I think it's less so in Australia, as I said before, but I just encourage people that I think there is some rich, deep veins of ministry to mine there. And that's only going to continue. The lack of connection, people are starting to realize.
Okay, is there any further thoughts on that one? No. My final question for you. Is there a new polarization?
Yeah, I just wanted to pose this. Is there, again, thinking forward, if things are changing, and I've just started reading Nate Silver's, who's the sort of data analyst, scientist, polling guy. He's written a really interesting premise in his new book. I think it's called On the Edge of Everything. Is it On the Edge of...
On the Edge, the Art of Risking Everything.
On the Edge of Art of Risking Everything. And his background is obviously looking at data, but his real background is a poker player. And poker players, like professional, it's a lot around risk. You're bluffing, you're guessing what's behind the other player's cards. And he talks about this new polarization that he's observed happening in society. And just for me, it was a really helpful little metaphor. I haven't finished the book, but I just thought I'd just drop it here as an early kernel of a thought. We might return to this. But he says there's a new polarization that has emerged around risk. He talks about the fact that there are certain individuals who have a much higher risk appetite than others. And that's always been true throughout all of human history. However, something has intensified this, and he sees COVID as a sort of almost, like you wouldn't know people's risk profiles necessarily, but COVID brought it into the open. So he talks about, the example he gives at the beginning of the book is, if he's in a supermarket line sort of at the end of COVID or, 2022 or something, and he could have a guy in front of him who's wearing, the N95 mask and like that's his one trip out for the day and he's washing his hands and he's avoiding COVID. But then the guy behind him is planning for his, he says something like his, cocaine-fueled a visit to a weekend of strip clubs in Vegas, and just these very two divergent approaches to risk that's happening. And he sees these playing out in individuals' lives. So we see that. And some of the sort of culture wars that happened over COVID were actually really not so much about the politics of freedom or, safety or, it's freedom or concern, that's all part of it. But part of it was also around risk appetites, and different countries have different risk profiles. But he says that what's happening, and he's talking about the US, but I think it applies to other places. Interesting for us in Australia to reflect on this. But I'll lay out his argument. He says that there's almost two groupings, and he calls it the river. This is risk. This is the guys doing AI, even though AI could, their warning could potentially turn into a super intelligence that, wipes out humanity. But the risk, well, we could make billions from it, trillions. He talks about the crypto people, banking on a complete new monetary system versus the safety of old sort of like just save in the bank.
Yes.
So high risk, high reward type people.
Yeah.
And he goes into all these different things. So very much Silicon Valley is risk. And, like you look at social media, like there's a sense where we want to connect with each other, but then also it could be completely tearing apart democracies,
Yes.
I can send you guys messages on Instagram, but can also be used by a foreign government to undermine, us, or we're exploited by big companies. So, high risk, high reward. And then he talks about you've sort of got the ruling class, and he calls it the village. So it's the river versus the village. He's got a lot of different areas within the river, and he goes through all the different types of people. But then you've got the village. The village is the establishment. This is your government. This is HR departments. And their whole thing is mitigating risk. This is the safety practices in the workplace. This is greater and greater compliance. This is, where you end up in endless HR meetings to avoid someone tripping over a fox at the Red Church office.
That's deep.
And, this is a really interesting divergence that we see. So what you see is you'll see people like Elon Musk talking about colonizing Mars and firing off, rockets and saying crazy things on Twitter. And even someone like Donald Trump with his appetite to just say things, which is very politically risky. When Donald Trump first emerged, we're like, his first few weeks, people were like, his campaign's dead. He just said that thing. He said, I could have shoot someone on 4th Avenue or whatever is it, and not go to jail. That's hugely risky.
Yes.
But it showed the emergence of this risk part of society. Yeah. But then on the other side, this management of risk. So, for example, the Biden government and NATO, European governments, like we're going to do this, we're going to support Ukraine and keep adding different weapons, F-18, Hornets or whatever now, but we're not going to allow them to do this. It's this constant doing quite risky things, but trying to mitigate that risk. Yes. Even the first economic thing we talked about, it's like this. But the problem is you get to this tension that's at the heart of growing things and building things, which is how much do you go into risk and risk a disaster, or do you so mitigate risk that you don't grow and build anything?
Yeah.
and you've now got a polarization. I think there was a moderation between those two things, but it's like the two sides are running away from each other. You've got people who are so risky. I mean, you think of even, again, you got people now who are on comedy shows who are just saying stuff which would get them cancelled, but you got other people who are so policing what they say. And it's a really interesting one for the church world as well, because increasingly in church, and again, understandably, like in Australia, after the Royal Commission around, child safe stuff, which, there's a lot of good stuff in there because there was terrible things happening in different churches around the abuse of children and minors and vulnerable people. But, do you get to this point where there's so much compliance, it's really hard to do stuff, where as a church, where you're literally as staff then just becoming professionals who almost have a relationship with their congregation similar to a counsellor, where I'm not seeing you out of these times. How do you do that when you've got, going back to social capital, you're trying to build social capital. So again, too, in the midst of this is another underlying contradiction driving destabilization in the culture. You've got these very different visions of the future. And I think it's only going to develop. And who takes government? The risky ones or the careful ones who are having stagnation? And I think in some ways it does mirror America's natural. Again, it's the superpower. You've had the people going out in the frontier, and then you have the people building the building back in the city, and sort of the cowboys and the professor back in NYU or something. So I just think it's a really interesting polarization, and in some ways as well driving, I think, the US election at the moment. So it's an interesting one, and even questions around, again, for the church, like, you've got this safety culture in the church, but then also, well, we're going to send missionaries to dangerous countries. It's just fascinating, a contradiction. Do I have an answer for it all? No. And in Australia too, I think we're very much, a country which, and particularly in our state, is very safety focused as well. But then you're also seeing, well, hang on, does that mean innovation and stuff like that doesn't happen in the same particular way?
Yes.
Just a really interesting thing. I think it's more like, again, here's the answer. You ready? No. I think it's a really interesting one to just be aware of, orientate ourselves in the world, and just sort of watch this trend develop. I think it's only going to develop more over the next little while.
I do wonder with that particular one, like, what is the role of faith as the church? And how do you grapple with that? Not risk too much, and not you want to honor and respect the laws of the of where you are. But what role does faith play?
That's a great question, and maybe that's the third village, or the church. We'll have the river, the village, and the church. Frank Ferretti did a book called The Culture of Fear, and he talked about, I don't know what, it's like some department in the United Kingdom which was trying, maybe like Labor, I don't know what it's called, but they were trying to basically get rid of all accidents. And he just was saying, you're never going to do that. And so on one hand, you can see safety as this centralized form of control, which tries to undo anything possibly going wrong. I've talked about here in Victoria, we're very successful in having a low road toll. And the idea that, we want zero. That's the goal of our road department or whatever is zero deaths on the road, which is a noble goal. But are you ever going to be able to achieve that because of just human error and human sin? So the danger that goes into control. But then also the sort of freedom builder, risk taker has also got a form of control out here. There's a conquering control there's a fleshly element to both of them.
Yes.
And maybe you're right, faith and the spirit is actually, wisdom, discernment, as gentle as doves, as wise as serpents. Maybe there's some sort of interesting paradoxology in the midst of that, which the church can model a way where there's an eternal perspective, there's a care in the moment, and actually, it's not a polarization. It's actually finding a third way forward. I like your thought.
It would be interesting to see how these trends continue to play out. Any final thoughts before we wind it up for today?
I don't have any final thoughts.
Great.
But Daniel may have some. I'm not sure.
I'm enjoying this conversation. It's been great.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, for taking us through those 3 underreported trends that are shaping culture. We'll continue to explore.
We should call them megatrends.
You love calling it megatrends, don't you?
Well, I just think people love the megatrends.
Yeah.
Like it's not as catchy as like 3 unreported trends.
All right. 3 unreported megatrends.
Megatrends.
That are shaping culture.
Let's risk it.
I prefer to play it safe.
Thanks for joining us. If you want a list of the different articles and books that were referred to in today's episode, you can subscribe to our mailing list by heading to rebuilders.co and subscribing there. Also, we teased a little something via the social media last week before, that we have an event coming up in Melbourne on the 22nd of October, and we've asked you to save the date.
Rebuilders Live.
Yeah, Rebuilders Live. So we'll have more details to you in the coming, hopefully, week. And we would love to have as many people along to Rebuilders Live.
What was that date again?
The 22nd of October.
22nd of October. And
2024.
22nd of October, 2024. And we'll have a special guest.
Yes, we will.
We're going to be looking at culture, creativity, renewal. I think you should risk it all. Just put it on your credit card.
Book that flight.
Yeah.
Great. We'll catch you next time.